Welcome, everyone, to the Authenticating Intelligence podcast. My name is Dr. Stephen Aguilar. I'm an associate professor of education at the University of Southern California, Rosser School of Education. I also co-direct the UC Center for Generative AI in Society. I'm joined today by Dr. Gale M. Sinatra. Dr. Sinatra is the Stephen H. Crocker Chair and Distinguished Professor of Psychology of Education at the Rosser School of Education. So she's, one of my favorite colleagues, really. She's also a member of the National Academy of Education, and she received all of her degrees, basically, bachelor's, master's, and PhD in psychology from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her co-authored book with Dr. Barbara Hofer is titled Science Denial: Why It Happens and What to Do About It. Welcome, Gale.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Stephen. It's delightful to be here.
Awesome. Yeah. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I think that when we're thinking about, this notion of what AI is doing to basically everything, I think one of the important pieces is how it's changing our ability to discern what's real and what isn't, and how do we change our attitudes based off of information when sometimes that information is not only synthetic, but it's wrong, or it's manufactured by AI. So, I think we can start with this organizing question. Does AI help us rethink what we believe and know, or does it freeze our concepts in place? So, what do you think of this overall question of AI and conceptual change?
I think it's a really interesting question that has to be explored much more through research. It's pretty new to be used in that way to support conceptual change. So I think there's a lot of open questions. I think what we're seeing so far is it has possibilities to do both. It has the possibility to change how we think for good and for maybe not so great. And it also has the possibility of sort of reifying what we already
Hmm.
know. So, as you've said many times, every technology tool, you know, promises to change everything about
Yeah.
how we think and learn. And in the beginning, everyone thinks it will, but in the end, it's just a tool, and
Yeah.
it will depend on how we use it. So I think we can unpack that a bit as we talk.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I'm glad you agree with me that that the AI it's really cool. It's a really fascinating and powerful tool, but we're still figuring out what the affordances of that tool are. What does it actually do? But let's take a step back, especially for folks that aren't necessarily familiar with this term of conceptual change. What is it?
So psychologists talk about um, mental representations of concepts being objects, things, people, ideas. So when you have a mental representation of a concept, you use that as part of your prior knowledge to
Mm,
think and reason about and everything from simple things like where did I leave my keys to complex
mm,
issues like solving a geometry problem to critical thinking, right? So concepts are critical to everything we do. So if you have incorrect conceptual knowledge, and that
mm,
means you hold a misconception, and this could be because you simply misunderstand something or because you've been taught or heard about or learned about through teachers or internet people on the
yeah,
internet,
there's some stuff that's not right on the
influencers,
internet. Yeah.
all sorts of places where we've gotten misconceived ideas. And so when I talk about science ideas that are misconceived, what I'm meaning is that there's a consensus in the scientific community about humans contributing to climate change. So um, that would be one of those misconceived ideas if you aren't accepting that. You can think of, people who are the flat earthers
Sure.
going against conventional wisdom about astronomical events like the shape of the earth. So there's those. And then there's, of course, all sorts of other kinds of concepts.
Yeah.
And the challenge with conceptual change is that there's some ideas that are really easy to give up and switch to a new idea, and some that are really difficult. And the difficult ones are things that we hold dear, that have personal meaning to us,
Yeah.
perhaps connect to our identities, and maybe emotionally fraught. So there's a whole array of ideas that aren't as easy to shift as others.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's easy for us to sort of get used to the fact that science has already done a lot for us, so we forget that there's a lot of work that's underpinning it, right? We don't talk about the four humors anymore. Like, my bile's in check as far as I know, but that's not really an idea that people think about, and it's silly. But we can see how sometimes silly things still kind of propagate, right? You mentioned flat earthers. For the record, I am not a flat earther. I definitely believe that the world is globe-ish. Maybe not a perfect sphere, but close enough. But
It's spherical enough.
yeah, but that gets at some of this that tension that you mentioned. If I do hold an idea to be sort of close to me, then sort of tricky things can happen, right? And a fairly easy misconception is this notion of sort of seasons, right? This idea that people think that, well, if the Earth is closer to the sun, that must be summertime. Obviously, that's a misconception, and maybe you can share a little bit about sort of how you've tackled these sort of basic science concepts before.
Yeah, so this is back to the general point of what is conceptual change and why is it important? So if you had a flat Earth concept, it doesn't help you explain a lot. So you're
Hmm.
going to have a real challenge with the day-night cycle and with seasonal change. You have to really, take your ideas into a pretzel shape to
Sure.
make that work. So the reason why conceptual change is important in these scientific concepts is that they underlie other concepts. And so you're
Yeah.
talking about seasonal change, you really cannot grasp seasonal change unless you have an understanding of a spherical Earth. So this is why conceptual change is important, because if you have a misconception, then everything that results from thinking about that concept is
Hmm.
also going to be incorrect. And that's where things like our misunderstanding that humans are contributing to climate change has broader implications, not just for climate change, but for understanding severe weather events and for
Hmm.
preparing us to be ready to address extreme weather caused by climate change. So seasonal change is a good example. It just can't really be understood unless you have a spherical Earth concept.
I want to pick up on this idea that it isn't just that, beliefs and the concepts that we hold sort of to be true are these discrete things that don't have other implications, right? Because they foreground everything else, right? If I come with a bias or with a understanding, like you said, that the earth is flat, well, then I have to shove everything into that model. And you mentioned this idea of a pretzel shape, right? This idea where you contort yourself into thinking things that have to be true given all these other sort of first principles I decided were true. And then very quickly, one is left looking silly, right? And even going back to sort of how health used to work, right? This idea of the four humors. I don't know them all. I know bile's one of them. I know that there was a yellow one. But like science sort of went forth from that. And then if you take that as your primary principle of how to make people healthy, well, then you're going to have to balance those humors, right? I'm going to have to throw a leech on you because you have too much blood. I think blood
Yeah,
was
be
one of them.
careful.
Yeah.
RFK Jr. might take that idea up and
Well,
recommend it as policy now in the United States.
well,
But yeah,
that's the
it's
idea. Yeah.
true that we move on from things in science when we discover new information and new evidence. And, it's not much easier for science to shift their thinking than it is,
Hmm.
for individuals. So it takes a long time for a shift to take hold. But when the weight of the evidence finally is there, then then everything shifts. Those are what we call paradigm shifts
Sure.
in science, and that's really in some ways similar to what happens to individuals when they have a wholesale change in thinking that results from a conceptual change.
Let's get into these barriers, like the traditional barriers for conceptual change, because you sort of mentioned sort of emotional barriers or sort of beliefs. But in your work and in the science now, the book you wrote, what are some of the things that really hold people back in taking in new evidence and integrating it into their belief system?
So there's lots of factors. There's emotions, which we've mentioned. There's motivations. I'm sure that many of your listeners have heard of motivated reasoning. It's when people are sort of motivated to reason towards a preferred conclusion, but not
Hmm.
necessarily an accurate one. So that's a big one. And one of the most important ones is identity.
Mm,
So people do tend to accept the thinking of the group, right? So
mhm.
human beings evolved as social beings. They their survival was dependent on a group. Humans alone weren't really able to
Yeah,
survive. So, you want to be part of a group for your own personal safety, and you don't really want to be kicked out of a group because you probably aren't going to last. And so the ideas of your group are pretty compelling, and you're likely to try and get on board with those ideas. So if you have an idea that conflicts with your group's idea, it's really hard for people. I remember teaching about biological evolution
mhm,
to students with strong concerns that conflicted with their religious beliefs, and they would say things like, I can't go home and tell my family that I even read this
sure.
information. So that's a good illustration of how, like, you don't want to cause a rift with your family, your friends, or community by thinking differently. So identity is a huge factor that's either supportive or not supportive of conceptual change.
Yeah, and I think that that's a super important point for folks to think about, especially sort of as we think about this emerging information landscape. It used to be that your identity was more proximal, right? It's me, my family, my extended family, maybe some people in organizations I go to. People sort of gravitate towards their own affiliations. Like I shout go blue if I see someone wearing Michigan gear because that's where I got my PhD. So it's you want to feel connected to groups of people, and you pull towards sort of that group and some of those beliefs. So, and it is hard to go against the grain, right? History, it has a ton of, scientists even that were in prison for going against the grain.
Yeah, it didn't end well for Galileo. I mean, people who have ideas that are inconsistent with the general group's identity and their ideas, that never goes over well.
Yeah, and it's it takes a little bit of bravery, a little bit of arrogance, really, to decide. Well, I'm going to go against the group, and I like how you started that point, right? Which is, let's picture a time when it was just small groups of people moving around and surviving. Then, if there's a guy who's just constantly disagreeing with the group and saying, well, I actually think food's to the west and not to the east, everyone's going to be like, well, we've been here longer. So it's this powerful impulse, and and I want sort of folks to understand it's not necessarily an incorrect impulse unless it leads you
No, I mean,
astray,
it
right?
led to, more survival. We're not that big and we're not that strong as far as, animals go. I mean, our survival depended on us being in groups with others who could help, you know, warn us of impending danger or protect us from some kind of onslaught. So, yeah, it was a good thing to hang with the group.
Yeah.
And so we've done that, and it's been a successful strategy. So anything in evolution that was successful, that's something that would be very hard to go against. And so, we're not in the environment now. Can you imagine how different the AI landscape is from the savannah? We're not in an environment now that affords the
Yes.
same type of thinking and reasoning that was helpful and useful for millennia. And that
Yeah.
is a real difficult shift, I think, for humans to make.
There's this fragmentation that's occurring. It's still occurring. It sort of has been this slow burn where this ability to be a part of a group has shifted, right? It's not proximal. Now it's distal. Now you have affiliations with communities that are online, that are through social media. And these can be powerful communities, especially if you happen to be like the odd man out or the black sheep. You find, the black sheep, hashtag and follow all the other black sheep. And now you're a happy black sheep. But that has that's challenging. Like, because there's this fragmentation that can make it difficult to really build communities, and AI is sort of now sort of interfering with that or making that even more complex. There's more fragmentation because, now we're not even interacting with artifacts, with things that are real. Now there's manufactured content that has no existence in the real world, but people can still gravitate and organize around it. So I think, we can start to really think about, well, now that we have a basic understanding of what conceptual change is, what are your thoughts on how AI is going to help or hinder this process of conceptual change?
So, the way that conceptual change happens when it does happen, and it's pretty rare, is you have to think really deeply about a topic and you have to weigh conflicting points of view. And AI could either support that or hinder that. So, one way that it can hinder it is it can, tell you things that you want to hear,
Hmm.
or it could tell you things that are even incorrect. It has the ability to hallucinate, as
Sure.
it's
Yeah.
called, and make things up. So that would obviously be a hindrance. Another way it would be a hindrance is when we just seek simple answers. And
Hmm.
if AI just gives us the simple answer, we're not weighing two points of view against each other. We're not thinking deeply. So that those are situations that would not promote change. I have seen some research where people don't like to change their mind. And in one reason they don't is people really don't like to be corrected. They don't like to
Sure.
be
Yeah.
told they were wrong. They really hate that.
Yeah. I don't
And
like
I've seen some
it.
nobody really loves that. So I've seen some interesting research where um, AI has been used to refute misconceptions.
Hmm.
And because people don't really perceive it as a person back there, which really it
Hmm.
isn't,
Yeah.
then they're not as, quote, embarrassed that they're wrong. So it's easier to sort of be called out by a bot or somebody, um, you know, magically behind a screen.
Sure. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's less embarrassing because you're not being called out as incorrect in a group or by another individual. So there's a face-saving element to changing your
Hmm.
mind when AI is prompting you with new information. And I have seen some research that can be effective. But obviously, that's in a controlled research environment, right?
Sure.
So if you're
Yeah.
you know, just Googling, never mind AI for a second. If you're just Googling, is climate change, are humans contributing to climate change? When you Google that, you're going to get a lot of mixed information. In order for AI to really support conceptual change, it would have to be consistently giving you correct information. And I think we don't know that it does that.
Well, it gives, obviously all AI tools give information based off of their training set, right? And one of the biggest criticisms of early chatbots and early LLM models was, they were trained on quote unquote the internet. And I don't know about you, but there's lots of lies out there on the internet, and
Right.
not even, not even lies that are meant to be malicious, right? It just could be people being silly on like Reddit, for example. Like one of the slides I use for my talk is like, people want to know, how do I keep cheese on a pizza? And when the LLM spat back out, use Elmer's glue. And that happened in the response because the data that trained that particular version of the large language model was, scraping Reddit, and that was a high voted post, not because it was accurate, just because it was funny, right? And or it could have been, or it might have been informative, right? That they do that in commercials to make it look super cheesy, but it's really just super gluey. So I think that when we're thinking about this idea of can AI help or hinder conceptual change, I think that's an important consideration. The first is, what data is it trained on? And
Right.
not, people don't have to necessarily know that. But the second part I think is this place that's really ripe for opportunity, which is currently no one has an attachment to an AI chatbot. It isn't the case that like I go to my alumni chatbot and I'm really going to believe the University of Michigan one because it's a chatbot, and I'm going to believe it more than like the Gemini of the world or the Google bot. But like that just doesn't happen. So this idea of using technology, to save face or to explore ideas in a quote unquote safe environment and safe, not in the sense, because I know that folks over respond to like, safe spaces are silly and things like that. But I think that's sort of overstating the point. It's a sandbox. It's a play space where
Yep.
consequences are effectively zero, right? You can say what you want, you'll get a response, and that's a perfect opportunity to reflect. That's how learning happens, when you feel like you can just explore without negative consequences. And I think it's important for folks to really think about, what that means when we're thinking about AI and conceptual change.
Yeah, so these studies I've seen, I think they're probably, using a controlled set of training materials, to make sure that as they're trying to promote conceptual change, they're not introducing
Hmm.
incorrect information. But if you were going to just use an open AI type, chat GPT or something, I don't know. I've had pretty good success in trying to get ChatGPT to lie to me, and it hasn't. I mean, I've tried to get it to tell me that climate change was a hoax. I've tried several times, and it has not done that. So I'm impressed that, so far it keeps defending a scientific point of view on that. But I'm sure if you ask the prompt the right way, you probably could get it to tell you it was a hoax based on training materials. So it's really hard to know if it's going to just by itself, without it being in a controlled environment, be able to confront misconceptions.
Yeah, and and it isn't necessarily the case that you should use any of the Gen AI tools as these interlocutors that you're using to sort of vet these ideas, right? I think that current generation models are actually fairly accurate and don't hallucinate as much as they used to. There's still problems, but they're actually pretty good. I've had it help with coding. The different models help me with coding exercises, taking sort of some administrative tasks, like just accelerating how quickly I can do some of that stuff. But it isn't the case that they're perfect. They're seductive, but they're not perfect. And I think it's important for us to think about that. When you used the model, was it still patting you on the head saying that you were asking really good questions, like or something like that when you were engaging with it?
No, I tried a few different times, to get it to tell me, just ask, "Is climate change a hoax?" And
Yeah,
it would come back with no. The scientific consensus is, that the Earth is warming and humans are contributing. And I've tried it at different times. I didn't just do it all at once to
sure,
see if the models were changing, and I have yet, thankfully, to get it to tell me that. But in both of our examples, me with climate change and you with coding, we both already know the right answer.
sure.
And so we can sort of check it. And I think that's the tricky thing. Like, let's imagine that you're a kid who wants
Mm.
to know if dinosaurs and humans were on the earth at the same time. Well, I know that if you just Google that through a regular Google search engine, pretty quickly you actually get pictures of dinosaurs with saddles on them and a lot of misinformation. So I don't know if large language models pulling off the internet are going to be accurate if a student were to use AI to ask that question, and I don't know if that one would come through as accurate. It's something worth trying, but the point is, when we already know the correct answer, we can we can check. But somebody who's really curious and doesn't know, they're not going to know if they get an incorrect answer back.
This is true for any sort of like expert in any field, right? There's this gut check. We might say, well, that there's something about that I'm going to dig into a little bit more, and then you use the tools of your expertise. A close friend of mine, like sells electronic parts, and now what he's seeing is that there are people that come in with a diagram that ChatGPT made and says, "I want to build this," and he's like, "Well, this cannot be built. Like,
That's not a
whatever.
thing.
It looks like it works, but people coming in, this is overstating the example, but like the perpetual motion machines. Like I prompted ChatGPT to make this thing that physics says is impossible. Give me the components, right? So this idea that novices can sometimes sort of believe what they see a little bit too much is risky.
Right? I've had that experience lately, because as you know, these deep fakes are now really good. And so, if you watch cat videos on Instagram, and I do,
Yeah,
eventually you
we all
get
should.
some videos that you think that's not real, but you're not sure. Again, having the expertise, um, I know if it's right, if it's about climate change, but if I see some of these wild animals. I've
Hmm.
seen a bunch of them lately, of wild animals, tigers, for example,
Yeah.
lions, um, picking up a uh, one of their pups or one of their
Or the
kits
Cubs.
or
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever they're
Yeah.
called,
Yeah.
and dropping them to a human to protect them from a predator, and I'm like, "Did that happen? Like, really? I don't know."
Yeah.
That's an
I think
interesting
I've
one
seen
because
that one. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't have the expertise to know. So, I don't know if that's right or not because that's not in my area, and then I see that and I think, what if somebody is, convinced of
Yeah.
false information when they don't have the information to critique it. I look at those videos and I think they're probably not real, but I don't know. They could be. I have no idea.
Yeah, yeah, no. As deepfakes get better, they're the really bad ones where you sort of see cats playing the piano. And you're like, that's cute, but it's dumb, and I don't like it, or I like it a little. Like, and it's just sort of this candy entertainment. But then there's sort of this more subtle stuff which you mentioned, which is, taking and likely, I'm speculating here, but it could have started from a real video of a tiger
I
doing something.
suspect there was like sort of one, and then they sort of, then
Yeah,
then it's just gotten out of hand, and maybe there was one once, and I don't think that it's happening across, bears and polar bears and coyote. I've seen it
right,
all over the
right.
place. I'm like, I don't know. This is looking kind of
Yeah,
suspicious.
wild animals are not bringing us all of their children to
No,
protect them
I
because we're
don't
the
think
ones that are
so.
actually causing most of the harm, like
Exactly.
these days. So it's like,
Doesn't check out.
like here, take my baby. You're my oppressor. Like that makes no sense to me. But like, I do think that, you know, I think this is a good spot to really think about. Well, AI, because it's ubiquitous, because there's lots of generated content, lots of what I call like synthetic human artifacts. Um, that the average person has to think about, do that gut check, and sometimes do that gut check in an area that they're not familiar with, right? This example being the prime one. Like, I'm not an animal behavior expert. I have a cat, so the cat ones I can usually kind of get like suss out. It's like, well, there's one that I saw where it was a kitty, and they had like one of those optical illusions of like it looked like a hole and it wasn't a hole, and the cat fell and freaked out, and I'm like, what? The cat wouldn't do that. Like, cats are not dumb. Like, they know that that is not a real thing. And a lot of it comes from, at least if you any cat owner knows that, cats, like, they sense with their whiskers. They have whiskers on their feet. Like, you can't always trick a cat. They're pretty clever. So I'm defending cat intelligence here because I don't think that kitties do like a lot, even the sort of the weird things. It's obvious to a cat owner that a kitty wouldn't do that. But as a kid, if I, when Stephen of 12-year-old Stephen would have
Right.
been like, oh, cats are weird and like dumb. Like, look at this dumb cat, because I might not necessarily have the sophistication to suss out, back when I was a kid, we didn't have cats, and like, it's
And
just
it's
the
just
lived
not and it's
experience.
not kids. When we see, these wellness influencers on
Mm,
Instagram selling, you know, all sorts of supplements that are gonna cure everything from hair loss to cancer, and adults are buying those, and so that's where you see adults being duped. So I don't know if that's an issue, um, with adults falling for
yeah.
information on AI. I I think the challenge is, how do we know? And how do
Mm,
we check on the sources that we're getting out of AI? One time, way at the beginning of ChatGPT, I asked it to give me my own references, my own
oh yeah,
scholarly references, just as for fun to see what
it's
it
gonna
would
happen.
do.
Yeah, yeah.
And it gave me one that I was like, that sounds familiar. Let's see, I have published in that journal. I have written with those co-authors, and that's a topic I've written on. And I literally had to check my own CV.
Yeah.
And it was so close, but it wasn't real.
Yeah, no, I did this. I think when you did it, I'm like, I'm going to try. And, I don't have nearly as many publications as you. So I do mostly remember what I've written. But, it's kind of awesome to be in a position where, like, I wrote so much that could have been a thing. I don't remember. But, like,
It could have
you
been
know,
something I wrote 20 years ago. I don't know.
yeah. But I did it too. And it came back with obviously a citation list that was, we'll call it like 90% in my wheelhouse, and with really cool titles. I'm like, that's a good title for a paper I didn't write. And
I'm gonna write that paper
well,
because it sounds like
that
gold.
was my initial reaction. I'm like, can I write that paper? What's this fake paper about? Maybe I can take the core idea and make it work. But, that I'm being silly, but, that's sort of this potential of using AI for ideation, for like thinking through things, which is, I think, we're in a position where that's easier to do. But, when we're thinking about what, is given all your work in conceptual change and given sort of everything you know about how hard it is to shift conceptions that people hold dear, when we're thinking about generative AI technologies, what are your sort of, they can be research based, they could be sort of your off the cuff intuition based off of your expertise. But what do you think that the average person can do when sort of faced with this chaotic information environment that has a lot of, AI slop or just other AI content that is, trying to shift conceptions in subtle ways, or maybe it's reinforcing and reifying misconceptions. Like everything is possible now. So what do
Well,
you think that the average person should do?
I have a grant with Doug Lombardi and his colleagues at the University of Maryland to teach teachers to teach students in middle school how to source and evaluate scientific information they find online.
Hmm.
So we're not yet using AI, although I'm sure Doug will do that in the next iteration of his research.
Yeah, for sure.
But in the research we've done so far, if you Google something like I was mentioning about um, dinosaurs and humans being on the earth at the same time, and you do come across something like that, we teach a strategy called lateral reading,
Mm,
which I know means
hmm,
you open up another
hmm.
window and you research the source. And is this is a source that's reliable, that other people agree with, who are also experts? Is it somebody, from the Heritage Foundation? Who
Yeah,
are
like
these people? And you can do that with a regular Google search. I think it's a little harder to do with AI. Not um not
yeah, for
all
sure.
AI comes with citations. If they come with citations, as we've just discussed, they're not all accurate. And there isn't, quote, another window you can open up. I mean, sure, you can give it another prompt and ask it, who's this person? But
Yeah, yeah,
doing your own evaluation of that through another window where you're just saying, who's this person is, I think, different. And I
sure.
don't know if, Stephen Aguilar said this, and then I say, who's Stephen Aguilar? Are those in an AI set of prompts connected? So it's going to go back to the same. I don't know how that works. It might go back, so if you're not a credible source, is it just going to come back and tell me you are? I don't know. I mean, that's something I'm not really
Yeah.
sure on. Whereas if you open up a new window and just research this
Mm.
person, it's a new search, and so it wouldn't necessarily be connected. So I have a lot of questions about how easy it is or how difficult it is to evaluate sources the way we're teaching students to do it in regular Google searches. With AI, I think it's going to be a little harder.
My own off the cuff thoughts on this is that they're good analogs, like this notion of lateral reading, like because you could use a different AI engine, right? Like ChatGPT says this. What does Gemini say? What does it, Anthropic's Claude say?
But are people
Uh,
going to go to the trouble to do that?
well,
And
that's
that
yeah,
it's like an
exactly.
extra step. Whereas opening up a new window is kind of not that much trouble. But if you're already within, say, ChatGPT
Sure,
and you've
sure.
asked it some questions, you're most likely to just follow up by asking it one more. So I think the strategies that we have taught students, um, which we've found to be pretty effective, are going to have to be adapted for an AI context.
Yeah, and at the core of a lot of those interventions is new media literacy. But even at the core of that, if we drill down in terms of what all that stuff is, it's everyone just has to be super suspicious of everything, and not in a negative way, but not in a positive way either, right? It's always questioning, and that's sort of one of the things that I think that I was very fortunate, back when I was an undergraduate, as a philosophy major, one of the things that we did a lot was, question the argument. Like, what's the initial premise that is grounding everything else? And it doesn't have to be that abstract, right? If you get a piece of information, if a person is just talking to a friend and they say, well, do you know that so and so said that this other person did this other thing? You're not necessarily always going to believe them, right? There's obviously the people, the colleagues or the friends that spread rumors. You're like, well, chances are like 60% of this is real. Let me dig in a little bit more.
But I worry about over skepticism too,
Sure.
because,
How?
I think especially in the students where we really are
Mm.
trying to care about developing their scientific understanding in middle school and high school,
Mhm.
um, you also don't want to overcorrect and tell them to be skeptical of everything because teenagers can easily be skeptical of everything. And if they get to the
Yeah.
point where they don't trust anything they read, then they don't trust actual information from the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the definitive authority. Well, they're not going to
Mhm.
trust them either. I mean, so we have to be thoughtful about how to develop
Yeah.
a sense of honest skepticism while not inducing a sense that, you know, everybody's lying to me, because that's very unhealthy.
No, yeah, I agree, and it sort of leads to inertia, right? If everything is potentially not true, then I can't. Then how do I move forward? And I think that like one way to potentially think about this is, you said honest skepticism. I immediately, when you were thinking about that, thought about this idea of like weighted skepticism, where like you just weigh the opinions of some institutions of some people more than others, but you should know why, right? So obviously, like there's a paragraph in Authenticating Intelligence where I lament at how much work experts have to do now to just be listened to. It used to be when I was and I'm sure you get when we were getting all of our training, we're like, well, surely after I've spent all this time spending gaining and learning expertise, learning how to do research on this very narrow thing. Like most all academics are sort of narrowly trained when it comes down to it. We're experts, even you and I, like we're both educational psychologists, but we focus on entirely different areas within educational psychology. And we can talk to each other, but our areas are more narrowly defined than that. Um, Even all of that, I used to think, well, once I have that training, for the most part, people will sort of like understand, well, he knows what he's talking about. Because I do. Like it's not just a hope. Like I actually do know what I'm
Well,
talking about, as you do too.
absolutely. I remember having, reading about experts in, grad school, who had completely different points of view. But we
Hmm.
trusted that they were both legitimate experts that had legitimate disagreements in the field that had to be
Hmm.
resolved. And it wasn't like these people don't agree, so one guy's an expert and the other person is just out to lunch. We never thought that.
Right.
We were like, oh, there's an issue here to be resolved. If this guy thinks that and this woman thinks that, what does that mean? We've got to sort it out. And we never thought it was because neither had expertise.
Right.
So, you trusted the experts even when experts disagreed. And now today, like think of the whole thing with Fauci, the minute, he
Hmm.
contradicted himself on masks, that was it. His 60-year career went out the window, which is
Yeah.
crazy. He he
Yeah.
made a decision based on the evidence at hand. The evidence changed and he changed, and immediately
He was
that
a good
undermined his
scientist and was punished for it. Yeah. No, he was.
immediately his
Yeah.
expertise was questioned. We didn't do that back in the day. We would say, "Oh, what why has he changed his mind? What's going on here?" And we would dig into it.
Hmm.
If you saw a major figure in your field of psychology is like, "Oh, this isn't true anymore. This is true." You'd be like, "Wait, what?" But you wouldn't say that person is no longer an expert. But that's
Yeah.
what we seem to do now is one person changes their mind, we don't respect that there could be a good reason for the change.
Yeah, or the person who's on the opposite side who's very convincing, but is their opinions are grounded on sort of charm and sort of just a polished delivery as opposed to any deep expertise. And I think that's the challenge, right? And that change happened predates AI. Now we likely are in the world where we're going to have synthetic experts, right? These AI generated, quote unquote experts that are saying things that sound right. Maybe they're grounded in something that's true. But I think that, for the average person isn't necessarily going to want to spend the time to vet everything because that, again, that's
That's
causes
exhausting.
inertia. Yeah.
That is exhausting. We
Yeah.
don't have time in our lives, we have jobs, we have families, we have, people have kids to take care of. Who's got time to chase down every single piece of information and authenticate it? And that's why we don't
Hmm.
want people to be overly skeptical. And yet, sources that are trustable these days are hard to come by. I mean, we used to say trust the CDC. Now I'm not sure I trust the CDC anymore.
Sure.
because of significant changes in leadership there. So it's becoming harder and harder to figure out, who you can trust. And I think people need the skills not only in media literacy, but in
Hmm.
um, ability to evaluate the information that people are telling you. And, that's something I think we've always struggled with as educators is promoting a significant amount of critical thinking skills in students so that they can make those kinds of judgments.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that, obviously, there are no clear cut answers, but I think that that what's important is to sort of walk away with this notion that it's okay to be a little uncomfortable and to not be so certain all of the time, but it's also, but you want to avoid sort of not, being a nihilist and not believing in anything, right? And finding that and just always ensuring that whenever there's a deep-seated belief that it's backed by some sort of evidence, I think is important, right? So I think that in the age of AI, when we're vetting sort of synthetic information, information that was created by some sort of, LLM or image or video generation engine, that we should really be thinking about, well, you know, hey, is this for entertainment? If so, whatever. But at the same time, well, what do I believe after I've seen this thing? Is it reinforcing some belief? Is it sort of pulling me in a direction? And just really being reflective, because I think if more people are reflective for the most part, I think that we're guided toward better work if we're willing to reflect, and not simply, do what you mentioned, which is sort of using motivated reasoning, just searching for things that say, well, I believe this. Who else believes this? That person does, and just reinforcing that belief, because that's when our echo chambers sort of become prisons, right? Because you can't escape that echo chamber because you're just constantly looking for things that reinforce it, and I think that's generally a sort of an unhealthy habit.
Yeah, we're getting into an issue that scholars call epistemic trust.
Mm,
Who is it that you trust? What sources of information do you trust? And what are, your reasons for that trust? And I think that's something we need to really be thinking about because people need to be able to have the skill set
mhm.
to question, whether this is a trustworthy source or not, as well as evaluating the information itself. And, it used to be like you said, we would just trust the source when we knew who they were. Now I think you have to have a means of evaluating both the source and the evidence. That's what we're trying to teach in this grant, and I hope
Mhm.
it can translate into an AI environment. But as we were saying, we'll have to think about the affordances there and how to make it work.
Yeah, no, for sure. And, I think that we can sort of end our discussion by acknowledging that it's hard and but it's okay for things to be hard. And sort of my pitch for everyone is everyone's just going to have to work a little bit harder. Like in this sort of era of noise and
But the
disinformation and synthetic
irony is
content. Yeah.
the reason that people like AI is because it's easier.
Right. On
It's easier
paper.
to
Yeah.
find the answer to,
Yeah.
what were the causes of the Civil War essay that your 10th grade history
Hmm.
teacher wants you to write. It's easier to ask ChatGPT that than it is to think about it yourself. So I think the irony is exactly what you said, that, it actually takes more in-depth hard work and thinking, and yet the reason people are using AI is to do less of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So we live in interesting times. So I guess with that, thanks, Gail. I appreciate you taking the time to chat. And hopefully folks find this information helpful.
Thanks for having me, Stephen. It's been fun.